welcome to the Hearts Afire Podcast. Today's episode will feature a timely discussion about the horrific human rights violations currently going on throughout the world today, from the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the horrific treatment of Uyghurs in China. There is much to be discussed about these topics, as well as what we can do to ensure that there are human rights for all throughout the world. Before we get to our discussion, I'd like to remind you that whether you're watching this episode live or listening to it on a podcast, make sure to never miss an episode by clicking the subscribe button now. We appreciate your support of the Hearts Afire Podcast. Now on to today's discussion with our guest, Sister Ceil Lavan. For those of you who don't know her, Sister Ceil is an adjunct professor at the Metropolitan College of New York, as well as the justice coordinator and promoter of the Sisters of St. Dominic. And now I'd like to welcome Sister Ceil Lavan. Welcome.
Good morning, Katie. Good morning, everyone.
So, Sister Ceil, first off, it's great to see you, and I want to thank you for joining us today. And, when we were planning out this season's episodes back in early January, I knew you would be the perfect person to discuss this topic. But what I didn't know was how much would change in the world in just 2 short months. And, let's just dive right into it. Sister Ceil, in your opinion, what are human rights?
Well, Katie, human rights are standards that recognize and protect the dignity of all human beings. Human rights govern how individual people live in society and with each other, and they include the obligation the state has toward us. Human rights are universal and inalienable. They belong to each and every one of us equally. Human rights are inherent to the dignity of every human person across the globe. Pope Francis tells us that human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interconnected, and that they are rooted in the nature of the human person as an inseparable unity of body and soul. So there's no hierarchy of human rights. All rights matter. And that reminds me of the book Animal Farm, which is an allegory about animals liberating themselves from an abusive farm owner. In freeing themselves, the animals post a list of their rights, starting with, all animals are equal.
Amen.
So this went well till the pigs decided to move into the farmer's house, started drinking his whiskey and sleeping in comfortable beds, and then began to think of themselves as better, with the right to dominate and control the other animals. Eventually, the pigs posted their edited version of the animal rights at the Animal Bill of Rights, starting with, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So if we don't protect our human rights and the rights of all people, someone will take them away. Katie.
Yes, and Sister Ceil, in your opinion, how can we ensure human rights for all humans throughout the world?
Well, Katie, before looking at the world, I feel a need to consider how to ensure human rights here at home. The founding fathers, in creating the Constitution of the United States, put in 3 branches of government: legislative, judicial, and executive, to ensure that no one person or group could take control of the government. When the proposed Constitution was sent to the states, however, the people would not ratify it. They noted that the Constitution would protect the branches of government from each other, but they questioned, how will the people be protected from the government? The result of the people's action was the creation of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, identifying the rights of the people. As you know, our founding fathers wrote beautiful words about liberty, equality, and justice. At the same time that they were owners of enslaved people, and they did not free the African people they enslaved. So from the very foundation of this country, we have an enormous divide between what we say, our beautiful words about liberty and justice for all, and what we do, our lived reality. And just as the people in 1787 insisted that their rights be protected by the Constitution, so too we must insist that the human rights of all people be protected. In 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, only wealthy, property-owning white men could vote. No person of color, no woman, no working-class man, no indigenous person had the right to vote. But thanks to the Bill of Rights, over the years, people have added 17 more amendments to the Constitution, listing now 27 human rights. It took an amendment to the Constitution to end the institution of slavery. Over the years, indigenous, Black and brown people, women, white working men won the right to vote. People with disabilities and the LGBTQIA community used amendments in the Bill of Rights to demand their human rights. And these rights became laws because people were willing to suffer and struggle for years to win recognition of their rights, their inalienable human rights. So I say again, if we don't protect the human rights we have acquired, we will lose them. One example of people losing their rights has to do with voting. The right to vote is essential to democracy, yet there is a movement across the U.S. to deny certain people the right to vote. Last year, 19 states passed 34 new laws that make it harder for people to vote, particularly Black, brown, and young people. Some of the voter restrictions that have been legalized are banning early voting, limiting the number of mail ballot drop boxes, providing fewer voting sites, causing very long lines, and ending Sunday voting. In recent elections, people in Black churches have walked together on Sunday from services to cast their ballot, which encouraged more people to vote. Well, this new law would stop that in some places. So internationally, there are universal guarantees of human rights. Some of the sources of the UN are the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the International Charter of the UN Commission on Human Rights, and the Geneva Conventions, which address the treatment of civilians in time of war, which Russia is grossly violating right now in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. As well as organizations defending these rights, such as the Human Rights UNICEF Convention on the Rights of the Child, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International. Again, we're looking at the reality that governmental agencies, leaders, people with power often do not respect the human rights of the people because they put their own interests over that of the common good. People with power, the dominant group, often create laws to deny people their human rights. And if people don't stand together and protect each other's rights, those rights eventually won't exist. Maybe.
Yes, and very well said. And when talking about human rights as a whole, and talking about all of the individual rights, for you, what do you personally think is most important to you, person? Which right? It's a very heavy question.
Well, I had another question before that one.
No, I mean, when talking about how we
right.
ensure them for.
Yes, so I will answer that. Can I talk about?
You can talk about whatever your heart desires.
Okay. So in terms of the advocating and supporting the human rights for those who are suffering, even before the crisis in Ukraine, I've been hearing people say they've stopped watching the news because it's too depressing, and I can relate to that.
It's true.
Yeah, the stress of the present great divide in our country, the pandemic, and now watching Ukraine under attack is difficult to watch. So if in order to protect your physical and mental health, you need to limit how much news you watch, please do so. But don't stop completely, especially now. The people of Ukraine need us to see them. They need us to see their suffering. They need to know we care and we'll try to help them. But what can we do to help Ukraine? Well, you may have in your local area an organization collecting goods to send to Ukraine that you may want to contribute to. Or you may decide for the first time, maybe, to contact your legislator. Either tell them what you want them to do about Ukraine or thank them for what they are doing. Legislators are grateful for support from their constituents. Two nephews of one of our sisters, Diane Forrest, have gone to Poland to provide humanitarian assistance. Maybe you would be someone who would do that.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Or you may want to make a donation to help refugee children fleeing Ukraine. So you need a pen and paper, or you need to type this information. In order to know how to make a donation to a group called Amurtel, it's a disaster relief agency, and they're coordinating the overall work of the NGO humanitarian response teams in Siret, Romania, in welcoming Ukrainian refugees. So this group is training emergency trauma assessment. They're training the NGOs. That's a non-governmental agency. And they're training psychologists and teachers on psychological first aid. So when refugees arrive there after experiencing so much trauma, they are met by people trained to offer not only shelter, food, and water, but emotional support and a feeling of safety. So if you want to donate to that organization, you need to search, either Google search or search somewhere on a computer. If you don't have that, ask someone to do that for you. And these are the words you need to search. GoFundMe by Amurtel. So they're separate words with a space between each word. Go Fund Me by Amurtel, capital AMURTEL, to find the link to make a donation. And the link that will come up is Fundraiser by Amurtel, Help Refugee Children Fleeing Ukraine.
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing those resources, and I'll be sure to get those links once we're done filming offline and share them with our social platforms.
Thank you.
And Sister Ceil, obviously you are a busy woman between your work as a professor, your ministry as a professor, along with, being the justice promoter and all the wonderful work you do with the Blauvelt Social Justice Committee. If you could just tell our listeners about how are the Dominican Sisters committed to promoting and advocating for human rights for all. If you don't mind discussing the great work that the Social Justice Committee and the OPSCC does.
Good, I will. So, but before that, can I talk about the human right that I personally find most helpful?
You can.
Thank you. All human rights count. We need them all. But if I had to name a personal preference, it would be equality. If we don't really believe we're all equal, we won't respect the rights of those we think are less equal. In the same way, we respect the rights of those we think of as equals. Now, this is not something consciously that we do, but unconsciously, there are some people that are more important to us than others. The horrendous violation of the human rights of the people of Ukraine is beyond awful, and we should do whatever we can to support them. I also feel sad for the Russian people, many of whom are against their country's attack on Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And I'm worried that the Russians who are demonstrating against what Putin is doing will pay a very high price for demanding human rights for all. The West, that's us in Europe, care very much about the human rights of the Ukrainian people, their right to their homes, to education, to work, to healthcare, to what we in the United States describe as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There are several situations I could compare with Ukraine, and I've chosen two that I'm familiar with. I'm a supporter of Palestinian human rights. When Israel drops bombs on Gaza, Palestine, which it does routinely, there is no large-scale compassion for the suffering of the Palestinian people, and very few people speak out for their human rights. Last month, a report by Amnesty International found Israel to be an apartheid state and guilty of crimes against humanity by depriving Palestinians of their rights under international law. Human Rights Watch and the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem published similar reports. Did you hear that on the news? Did you watch that in your evening news? Very, very unlikely. We don't have that kind of compassion for the Palestinian people. I'm also a supporter of the movement for Black lives. The compassion for Black people struggling against violations of their human rights is minimal. And just as the Palestinians are labeled by many of our leaders and the media as terrorists instead of as the victims of terrorism, so too when Black activists struggle for their human rights, they are often labeled as the problem instead of as victims of our country's racism. If we really believe that we are all equal, we would care about the Palestinians and people of African descent in the same way we care about the Ukrainians. If we really believed that we are all one people, we would never dominate, control, occupy, and bomb another group of people because we would know that they are part of the US. So now I'll go into Blauvelt and what we do. As Katie mentioned, I am part of the Blauvelt Justice Committee, and the Blauvelt sisters have a very strong commitment to the work of protecting human rights. And we work in collaboration with the other Dominican sisters of Amityville, Caldwell, Hope, Maryknoll, and Spark Hill. And we collaborate in the work of justice with the Dominican women and men across the United States and in Canada. And Dominicans are also an NGO at the UN, which you know is focused on international peace and security built on human rights. Blauvelt has a belief statement and land ethic describing our commitment to human and environmental rights. We have made public commitments to take action against climate change, the death penalty, nuclear arms, white supremacy, and for immigration reform and women's rights. All of these issues are about human rights. We support human rights by participating in political action, such as demonstrations and contacting our legislators, and by financially supporting human rights organizations. Katie.
And I know too, the Social Justice Committee has also led many postcard writing projects to help get out the vote efforts. Are there any other projects you'd like to mention, or any specific sisters in their efforts with the Social Justice Committee that you
Well,
like to?
the committee is made up of Ceil sisters. Ellen Nash is an associate; she's a long-term member, and Celia Burns and Joan Agro and Diane Forrest and Dottie Maxwell, and I hope I said, and Joanne Fallis and me. And right now we're very engaged in working on the Laudato Si action platform, which comes from Rome, which is making the connection of all these issues, which you can quote the Pope on any issue that we are concerned about. The Pope has addressed it because he sees all the issues as connected, which we do too.
Yes, and we actually, for our listeners, if you didn't listen to this podcast back in, I believe it was December, Ellen Nash actually came on the podcast to discuss the Laudato Si Action Program platform and did a great job of explaining it to our listeners. So if you're interested in learning more about Laudato Si, I encourage you to listen to that episode, and you can find that on YouTube, Audible, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
Good.
So, Sister Ceil, as always, I enjoy our conversation.
Well, I have I'm sorry, my questions are out of order. I have actions that I would suggest be taken. So sorry.
It's all good, Sister Ceil. It's all good.
Especially thinking of Ukraine, as I already said, we need to pray for the people of Ukraine and for the Russian people. In my yoga class, we sent out a peace to Ukraine and to Russia, and one of the people in the class sent her piece to Putin, which I don't even think, but we really need to pray for Putin too, for him to have a shift of his thinking or behavior. And I do encourage you to be politically active, to send emails, to write a letter, to make a phone call to your legislator. And for some of you, that really means stepping out of your comfort zone. But if you think of what's happened to the people of Ukraine, for us to give a little of our comfort up wouldn't be a big sacrifice. So I encourage you to contact your legislators. They need to know that we're pushing them to do the right thing. And again, remember, if we don't continually support human rights, they will gradually disappear.
And Sister Ceil, talking about stepping out of comfort zone, what inspires you to get out of your comfort zone? Because, when you talk about all of that advocacy that you do for different issues, you're everywhere. So what inspires you to do that?
Well, two things come to mind. One is I worked and lived and worked in the Bronx, in Newark, New Jersey, in Chicago, in Boston, and everywhere I went, I heard Black people in particular, say exactly the same thing about the police stopping their children in their cars, and all exactly the same thing everywhere I went. So I couldn't deny that racism exists in this country. And the other thing is, I'm an anti-war activist. So when we were protesting against the war in Iraq, Lebanon was being bombed. The Palestinians in Lebanon were being bombed by Israel. And some of us wanted to carry signs to support the Palestinian people. But there was a divide in the group. And many of the people in the group felt, no, we just need to focus on the U.S. But the reason Palestine has so many problems is because Israel is the greatest recipient, receives the most money from the United States of all countries we support. And so after a bombing by Israel in the Gaza Strip, I went with a delegation from a group called Code Pink, and I saw with my eyes what happened to the people in Palestine. And that was 10 years ago, and it has not improved. It just gets worse. So when you see it with your own eyes, you have to do something. And the one thing the Palestinian people asked us to do was tell the people in your country what's happening to us, which is how I feel about the Ukrainians. They need us to know what's happening to them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this is the first war that you could ever, know to this day that is being seen through social media and with video clips and pictures, and you're getting all of this real-time updates and reportings that just brings a whole other dimension to
And
it.
a key element of that is that they're letting the Ukrainian people speak for themselves. When we watch like a Black Lives demonstrator, the announcers talk from their point of view and explain what's happening. Or when they talk about Israel bombing Palestine, they don't have Palestinian people talking. It's Americans talking about what they think it's all about. So this is really an important element that the Ukrainians are speaking for themselves, and their suffering is horrendous, of course.
And Sister Ceil, before you talked about the divide that is going on right now, throughout the nation, and in your opinion, how do you bridge that divide? How do you come together for unity?
Oh gosh, I think
We could talk about this for hours, for hours.
and I have found that that some of us are so set in our way, in our worldview. It doesn't matter what the facts are. This is how we see things. That just talking with people who are that cemented in their belief system gets you nowhere. But there are a lot of people in between who are pretty, they're tending one way, but they're not completely and 100% committed. That's where the conversations need to happen. Mm-hmm. And if we really listen to each other, the right and the left in this country, that's the great divide here. We find most of us care about exactly the same things.
Absolutely.
Most of us want the same things, but we have to figure out how to have those conversations.
Yeah, finding common ground is not always the easiest thing, but it's important to realize that we all put our shoes on the same way, and we have a lot more in common than when we think. And I hope we can find that divide. And if you were to give any words of wisdom or hope for those who are longing to find that sense of unity and who want to bridge the gap, what would that be?
Well, one of the things that came up in what I've been talking about is that I would encourage those of us who are in a position where we can do something to really consciously try to see like what bias or what prejudice is blocking me from seeing the whole picture. When I talked about how we see the Ukrainians because they look like us and they're European, and we're European descent. We don't have the same feelings toward Palestinians or toward people of African descent as white people. Um, but that's something that we can change because a lot of our thinking has just been there for years and years. It's been socialized into our brains. So if we pay attention to how we're seeing things, to look to see, is racism affecting how I'm seeing this? That can really help us to lessen the divide, the gap between us.
Yes, and Sister Ceil, I'm looking at the clock right now, and I know you're a busy woman, and obviously I could talk with you for hours, but I want to be mindful of your schedule. So, is there anything coming up for you or the Social Justice Committee that you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, except for the Laudato Si, and I would like to. One of the things, one of the issues that's sort of like basic to all of this is the money we have in politics in our country makes it really almost impossible to have really good democratic policies. So when people run for Congress, when people run for a political office, they need money, and the Supreme Court made a decision called Citizens United, where they said that individual wealthy people and corporations can give as much money as they want to super PACs that support candidates. Then the candidates are totally beholden to the donors, and they put that over the concerns of the people of the country. So if campaign finance reform ever comes your way, I encourage you to support it, because we need to get money out of politics so we can have real people like us running the country, who care about the people in the country, who care about the world, who care about our connection with all countries around the world. We have to learn how to get along, because we are, in fact, one people. We just make believe we're not.
So, Sister Ceil, again, I want to thank you for joining us. As always, I enjoy our conversations, and I hope that you will join us for future episodes.
Thank you, Katie. I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, I want to say farewell to Sister Ceil, and I wish you a good day. And before we go, I'd like to remind you that if you enjoyed today's discussion, please let us know by giving the Hearts Afire podcast a 5-star rating on wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we hope that you will join us in 2 weeks for our next episode of the Hearts Afire podcast, where Sister Alice Kirk will reflect on her ministry. Thank you again for tuning into the Hearts Afire podcast, and please know that you are in the daily prayers of our sisters and associates. Have a great day.